Hey everybody, it's Dan the Chess Enthusiast, and I'm here continuing my series exploring openings for the white player in chess. And in this video we're going to look at the Vienna Game. Now this game is a nice complement to the King's Gambit, as some of the lines do look very much like the King's Gambit accepted lines that I've already covered in previous videos. But the Vienna Game also has its own dynamic positions, so it's kind of the natural choice for the next white opening for me to examine. So the Vienna Game starts out with pawn to e4, pawn e5, and then knight out to c3. Now from this position, one of the themes that you'll see is an eventual f4 from white, getting into those King Gambit accepted lines, but it does depend on what black plays. Black here has two main responses, knight to f6 and knight to c6. The most commonly played move is knight to f6, so we'll look at that first before looking at the other variations. Now, after knight to f6, white has three options. The first is that f4 that I've already mentioned, and we'll look at that in detail in a moment since that is the continuation of the book lines. The second option for white, however, which I think personally is a bit more fun to play, is bishop to c4. Now, this does allow black to try to employ a tactic to go up a pawn in the opening, and what that would look like is after the knight captures the pawn, white just needs to be a little bit careful and not try to capture the knight, because then there's this little fork here, and no matter what white does, white's going to go down a pawn in the opening. So the best way for white to play this position is actually going to be to play the queen out to h5. And this is pretty much going to force black to play knight back to d6 so that it's protecting the pawn on f7 and simultaneously attacking the bishop. But from here, white can just pull the bishop back to b3 and there's still a lot of pressure on f7. Now, in order to protect the pawn that's on e6, black is going to develop the knights to c6, and then from here we have another really nice move from white, and that is knight out to b5. Now this move is employing the tactic of deflection, since if black captures the knight on b5, then queen to f7 is going to be checkmate. So the knight on b5 isn't really in any danger in this position. Instead, black can try to kick the queen, but then she can just fall back to f3 and keeping up the pressure on f7. From here, black can try f5, but then we have queen to d5, and black is still in the same bind. From here, the best way for black to alleviate the pressure is going to be queen to e7, but this is going to allow the knight to come in, land a fork on c7 with check, and after the king moves to d8, there goes the rook for white. Now, going back to this position, white has another option, and this is immediately capturing bishop on f7 check. But as long as black is careful here, the loss of castling isn't going to be a problem, because after the king captures, and then the knight comes in and captures on e4, all black is going to have to do is push the pawn forward to d5, and black is going to have some space and initiative in the center. Now, before going on, I did want to cover one trap that black might fall into in this position if they're not careful. If black here goes for just a routine development move like knight to c6, white here can now hit a check on f3. Now, it's still not too late for black, because after king to e8, black is going to be able to get out of any real danger with its king. But in this position, if black is not careful and doesn't really know what it's doing, then it might try to get into a castle-like setup and play something like king to g8. But this is actually going to turn out to be a huge blunder. In this position, white can just play knight out to g5, and the game is pretty much over from here. Because the best that black can do is to give up their queen. For example, if the queen comes down to g5, then we just have queen to d5, and that is going to be checkmate. Alternatively, black might try something like queen to e7 to guard the checkmate square, but here again we just have king to d5 hitting a check, and pick your poison. You can either just lose the game right away with queen to f7 and then that's checkmate, or you can give up your queen by moving the queen to e6 and then the knight comes in and captures it. So that's a little trap in the Vienna game. It's not one with a whole lot of bait per se. It's more just a trap that black has to unknowingly walk right into. But it is there, and if black does make the mistakes necessary to lay the trap, then you can definitely punish them as white. Finally, going back to this position, white's third option is to go for a Fianchetto setup. And from here, black can develop the bishop to c5, White fianchettos. Both sides develop their knights classically, and then we have pawn to d6 and pawn to d3, each side opening up its other bishop for development. And here we have pawn to a6 from black. Now, this particular move being played in this particular position looked a bit strange to me, and I was wondering why not just play castles right away. But after looking at this position, I think that this move is played to prevent here knight to a4, which would ultimately win black's dark square bishop. Because if we go to this position after pawn to a6, now if the knight jumps to a4, then the bishop is going to be able to tuck itself into a7 and be out of any danger. Now, I could be wrong about this, and if you have any thoughts or comments, those are certainly welcome. But that was really the only thing that I could see in this position why a6 would be played here. So after a6, now both sides can castle. And white here is going to take the opportunity to get the dark square bishops off the board. Because white's plan, as you'll see here in a second, is to double the rooks on the f-file, and they can't do that with the bishop pinning f2 to the king. So after the bishops are exchanged, black puts its other bishop on e6, preparing to battery with the queen. White develops queen to e2, and black gets the battery going with queen to d7, and here we have knight to h4. Now black, if it wants to, can harass the queen a bit with g4, but she can just slide over to d2 and she's out of any danger. From here, black can play knight to e7 to allow pawn to c6, which would prep a strike on d5. White can respond with rook to f2, and after c6, we have rook on a to f1. From here, black would want to avoid any sort of sacks on f6, which would open up the king's position, so the knight is going to retreat to e8, and then white here can play d4. And this is the end of the Fianchetto variation, and here white has a slight advantage, some nice pressure, and the initiative. So the last thing that I'll say about the Fianchetto variation is that the late great world chess champion Emanuel Lasker really enjoyed playing this line, so there's a little bit of advocacy for this variation for you. Okay, but going all the way back here, those are some of the options that white has in this position here, but the book lines actually continue with pawn to f4. Now, as I said, this line can lead to some King's Gambit accepted lines, but black's best bet here is to go into the Falkbeer counter gambit territory with pawn to d5. A move like pawn captures ef can be met with just a pawn push to e5, and then if we have the queen out to e7, we can play queen out to e2, and then the knight is going to have to fall back to g8, and white is going to have space and good development and good central control in this position. So that's why going back here after the pawn push to f4, like I said, it's best for black to play pawn to d5, getting into Falkbeer counter gambit-like territory. Now from here, white can capture the pawn, f captures e, and then the knight can come down and capture the pawn on e4. Now from here, white can develop the knight to f3, and black can develop the bishop to e7. And from here, the book lines finish up with pawn to d4 from white, and then black can castle, and white develops bishop to e3, threatening to win a pawn, so black is going to play pawn down to f5. White can capture en passant, and black recaptures with the bishop, and after white finally castles and black develops the knight to c6, in this position both sides are pretty equal according to computer analysis. Maybe a slight advantage for white, but you know, it's just out of the opening. So those are the main lines for the first variation of the Vienna game after the knight out to f6. But if we go back to this position right here, black might choose to simply mirror white, especially if they aren't too familiar with the opening and they don't want to risk anything. This leads, of course, to different lines, but they aren't as dynamic as the ones following knight to f6, so I'm going to go through them a bit more quickly here. In this position, white is going to develop the bishop out to c4, and black can either continue playing symmetrically with bishop to c5, or black can play the knight out to f6. And actually, first we're going to take a look at the line bishop to c5. Now, from here, the queen from white is actually going to jet out to g4 with pressure on g7, since the bishop is no longer guarding that square. Now, from here, black does need to be a little careful. The best move in this position is simply pawn to g6. The queen here is going to fall back to f3, and the knight comes out to f6. and then white develops its own knight, knight on g to e2, and then d6 from black, opening up the light squared bishop. From here, d3 opens up white's dark square bishop, and black can attack the queen, but the queen just pulls to g3 and is out of harm's way. From here, black can actually exchange the bishop for the knight, and afterwards play knight out to a5, and then white plays bishop back to b3. And the computer scores this position as a decent positional advantage in favor of white. However, going back a few moves to this position here, I did say that black needs to be careful how to respond to the threat of queen captures g7. g2 is the best response, but if a black player isn't too familiar with the position, they might play queen to f6. Now, queen to f6, while it looks like a strong move with pressure on f2 from both the queen and the bishop, is actually a mistake. Because knight to d5 here is just a killer move. Now, this is inviting the queen to come down to f2 and hit a check, but the king can simply slide over to d1 and is out of danger. Meanwhile, black still has to deal with the threat of queen captures on g7, and so is pretty much forced into king over to f8. From here, though, the black queen's days are numbered. Knight to h3 kicks the queen back to the only available square, d4, but after d3 is starting to look mighty cramped. Black can open an attack on white's queen with d6, but here the queen just plays to f3 and black is in serious trouble. After bishop captures on h3, white doesn't even need to recapture. Instead, rook to f1 pretty much seals the deal. Because there is a lot of hurt coming down on f7. And what's more, if black tries, say, bishop to e6 to defend, well, from here, if you want to, you can pause the video and try to find the move, but the simple pawn move of pawn to c3 actually traps that queen, and from here the game's pretty much over in favor of white. So that's another blunder that black can stumble into if they're not careful in the Vienna game, and that's how white can capitalize on it. Okay, so that is what can happen if after bishop to c4, black continues with the symmetrical approach. And as we saw, it's not really the best variation. Instead, knight to f6 here is going to be much stronger and more solid. From here, white can play d3, and black can come down with the bishop to pin the knight to the king, and white's best option here is to pin black's knight with its own bishop in return. Black can stimulate an exchange, and white here should capture on f6. Now here we have very subtle move order, because if black immediately recaptures with the queen, after knight out to e2, if black decides to capture the knight, white can recapture, and the knight here is actually poised to land on d5, which is threatening the queen directly and a fork on c7 with check. So before the queen recaptures in this position here, it's actually going to be slightly better for black to immediately capture the knight with check, double up white's pawns, and then the queen can come down and recapture the bishop on f6. From here we have knight to e2, d6, and white here should push d4, and then both sides can castle, and this position right here is pretty much equal. Finally, there is one more variation to look at briefly. If we go back here to move 2 from black, knight out to c6, white does have the option of still pushing pawn to f4, and what that can result in is the Hampe-Mugio Gambit. Now, if you've been following my videos, you might remember the video I made on the Mugio Gambit and the King's Gambit accepted. And as you can probably tell from the name, the Hampe-Mugio Gambit is very similar. It just comes about in the Vienna game. Now, what that looks like is after the pawn is captured and the knight comes out to f3, black is going to push g5, and then white develops this knight out to c4, and black pushes g4. Now, I did mention this in my video on the Mugio Gambit, but at this point, white is pretty much committed to this line, since moving the knight would allow queen out to h4, hitting a check, and that could lead to some complications with black's pawns in the vicinity. But if white does stick with this line, then it gets a really strong position, because after the castle, black can play the pawn captures the knight on f, and then the queen recaptures, and as you can see here, even though white is down a minor piece, they're way more developed than black, and there's a lot of pressure built up on f7. And that is the Hampe-Mugio Gambit, like I said, very similar to the old Mugio Gambit from the King's Gambit accepted. So anyway, that's going to do it for this video. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope that you have learned something. I know I went over a lot of material, and it seems to me like a lot more than in my previous videos. One thing I would be interested to know is if you think I went over too much, or if you like the detail. I do want to make my videos as comprehensive and complete as possible, but if the way I'm doing it is too detailed or borderline tedious, please do let me know. maybe with some suggestions on improving the videos. So that'll do it. Stay tuned for the Grandmaster videos to follow soon, and thanks for watching.